Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Brain. I want to welcome you to this special presentation, Top Trends and Challenges Shaping Procurement Leader Priorities, the fifth and final in a series of webinars in 2022 on 5 keys to unlocking supply chain value in a time of crisis, presented by Gartner and Supply Chain Brain. Quick reminder, there will be an audience question and answer session at the end of this presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit their questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Now, for decades, procurement leaders have focused on transforming their teams into a more strategic function. For most, this calls for a vision of diversifying procurement's mission to become more agile, responsive, and proactive to business needs as they evolve in real time. But this transition has never been easy, and emerging trends are making it even more complex today. So today we're going to talk about how procurement leaders can isolate the trends affecting them, unpack the challenges they pose, and prioritize actions needed to shape strategic plans now and into the future. With that, I want to introduce our speaker for today. Ryan Polk is Director of Procurement Research and Advisory at Gartner, Inc. In his current role, he works with heads of procurement and their team members to solve such challenges as supplier management, category management, strategic sourcing, risk management, and functional transformation. So with that, I want to bring Ryan in. Ryan, turn it over to you. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Bob. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where in the world you're joining us from today. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Ryan Polk, and I'm an analyst within Gartner's supply chain practice. As an analyst, I spend my time researching and advising clients on their mission-critical priorities. My specific focus areas include category management, supplier management, and the future of procurement. Today, I'm going to be talking a little about all 3 of those. Our story today begins with an acknowledgement of where we've been and where we are. I think it's fair to say we've experienced quite a bit across the last few years. We've seen protests, pandemics, floods, energy crisis, war, and economic instability, to just name a few things. And so as I thought about delivering a webinar on trends, challenges, and priorities in procurement in the year 2022, I reflected on just how many angles we could take this topic. And so I had 2 guiding principles in the development of this webinar. First, I didn't want this presentation to have a short shelf life. I wanted it to have some staying power. Second, I wanted it to be broadly relevant to each of you on the line today, regardless of the industry or the location you're joining from. And so as I reviewed data from our client conversations, the data we're collecting in surveys, and the conclusions we're making off the back of both of those data sets, I looked for those cross-cutting trends, challenges, and priorities that reflect and speak to the macroeconomic and socio-political paradigm shifts that we seem to be experiencing right now. Ultimately, that resulted in the exploration of 3 issues that make up the agenda for our time together today. First, we're all feeling the pressure from our stakeholders to create value in new areas like sustainability, diversity, innovation, and customer experience. And so the first question we'll explore is, how do we balance it all? And how do we achieve success? Next, we've all seen the headlines about supply chain disruption, risk, and bottlenecks. So the next question we'll look at is, how do we manage it all a bit more effectively? And then finally, I'd be remiss not to acknowledge the human side of all of this. We're all so tired right now. Our research shows that a shocking 85% of us are burnt out. And so what can we do as procurement leaders to reduce the cognitive overload that we're all feeling right now? And so what I'll do is I'll take you through each of these in turn. First, by focusing on positioning the trends that we see, the challenges that they pose, and some subsequent actions that you can take in response. Let's start with balancing stakeholder needs and stakeholder pressure. One of the biggest trends that we're seeing right now is that stakeholder pressure is increasing on our businesses from all angles. Investors are increasing pressure on us to deliver more and more ESG progress. We see consumers pressuring us by voting with their wallets. Employees are pressuring our firms by voting with their feet. And governments are pressuring us by regulating more and more behavior. And all of this pressure is forcing us in procurement to expand our focus beyond the traditional cost, quality, and speed to include emerging priorities like DE&I, innovation, worker well-being, modern slavery, and environmental sustainability, to just name a few. And let me be clear, this is not to say that cost, quality, and speed become somehow deprioritized. Rather, instead, it's to say that all of these other things are being elevated in their importance. And what's interesting about this is that as it happens, as we elevate these other priorities, it's changing how leading procurement teams are prioritizing their functions' value streams. What we're starting to see is that category management and supplier management are being viewed as equal to, if not more important, than strategic sourcing is today in this new paradigm. Category management is growing in importance because in a world where we have so many priorities, a one-size-fits-all approach to spend management no longer works. We need decisions being made at the category of spend level, not the indirect or the direct level. There's just too many stakeholder priorities that impact different categories differently, that a one-size-fits-all approach no longer works. And then the reason supplier management is becoming more important is because as a value stream, it's just simply far more effective at achieving progress on nearly all of the emerging procurement priorities that we're talking about. Sourcing is really, really great at delivering the cost, quality, and speed, but supplier management is really able to scale our impact on the emerging priorities. Now, I will say that when I talk to procurement leaders about this, I think they generally agree with these trend lines, right? They see, in general, the level of criticality around category management and supplier management growing. However, here's the problem. By and large, as a function, we are still very much optimized for yesterday's world. On the left, what you're looking at is data from our procurement score assessment. And what you'll notice here is that as a function, we are far more mature, and we place much more importance on sourcing than both category and supplier management. And then on the right, you see part of the reason why. Data from our budget and efficiency benchmark shows that roughly 2/3 of procurement staff are focused on sourcing in some way, shape, or form, leaving only 1/5 to focus on category management and about 1/10 to focus on supplier management. Now, this data isn't entirely surprising to me. We've been focused on cost, quality, and speed for so long, and sourcing is such a great vehicle for that, that it makes sense we've optimized for it. However, we're no longer being asked to focus on only the traditional. More is now expected from us. Therefore, we need to expand what we do, and category management and supplier management are the future. In category management, that means defining and elevating what category managers do. We need category managers to become the CPO, the Chief Procurement Officer, of their categories of spend. That means they need to be elevated into positions where they can think about the internal and external variables impacting their categories, where they have the time, energy, and resources to build strategies, not just process sourcing events, where they can work towards aligning the actions of all value streams, like sourcing and supplier management, to a single North Star. In a world where so much is now being asked of procurement, we need strategic category managers that can identify the most efficient and effective way of delivering value in a specific way that category demands. The reality where category management somehow becomes strategic sourcing with a new name must end. Category management is the toolbox, and sourcing is but one tool within it. It may be the most used tool right now, but it's certainly not the only tool. And so this all starts with elevating the position of category manager, and frankly, defining what category management is, and perhaps more importantly, what it is not. On the supplier management side, we need to lean into supplier collaboration to a far greater extent than we are today. What's interesting about all these new procurement priorities that we're talking about is that they truly require a village to achieve. Think about it. Things like better risk management, more resilience, innovation, sustainability, and diversity. These all require active participation from our supplier ecosystem to make happen. We simply can't do it alone. So what we see leaders doing is moving away from viewing the supply ecosystem transactionally in favor of a reality where suppliers are viewed as an extension of the business. And once that happens, we're able to foster connections with suppliers to create real and lasting value. What these leaders are recognizing is that in the 21st century, businesses aren't competing against other businesses. It's really more the case that supply chains are competing against other supply chains. To be successful here, though, we need a much more formalized and standardized supplier management process. I would bet that many of you here are looking at supplier management within your organization. You may even be doing some of the steps on the page that you see right here, like segmenting your supply base, managing supplier performance with scorecards, or doing some continuous improvement. But if I were to ask you if your supplier management process is as standardized, as codified, and as embedded into your way of working as, say, the 7-step sourcing process is, I'd hazard a guess that almost no one would say that it is. And there's the grand challenge for us all in the supplier management space. If we accept that progress against the majority of the emerging procurement priorities requires better supplier management to make happen, we need to get a lot more serious about formalizing the process of supplier management. We need to policy it. We need to SOP it. We need a standard operating procedure it, quote unquote, to at least the same degree that we have for sourcing right now.
E2 Open is the connected supply chain platform that empowers the world's largest companies to transform the way they make, move, and sell goods and services. With the broadest cloud-native global platform purpose-built for modern supply chains, E2 Open connects manufacturing, logistics, channel, and distribution partners as one multi-enterprise network, tracking over 12 billion transactions annually across more than 400,000 enterprises. The E2 Open platform anticipates disruptions and opportunities to help companies improve efficiency, reduce waste, and operate sustainably. Moving as one. Visit e2open.com. I want to tell you about 4 opportunities to meet with many Gartner expert analysts at 2 events next year in 2023. The Gartner Supply Chain Symposium and Expo, May 8th through 10th in Orlando, and June 5th through 7th in Barcelona, Spain, and the Gartner Supply Chain Planning Summit, October 30th through 31st in London, November 29th through 30th in Phoenix. Premier gatherings of thought leaders and industry experts pushing the boundaries of supply chain and supply chain planning. Learn more at gartner.com/conf/SC.
So let's switch gears here a little bit. And let's talk about another big issue for procurement leaders right now, and that's risk. Let's start with the obvious. High impact risk is globally pervasive. It feels like risk is everywhere right now. There's so many new events that seemingly happen every couple months. It feels like we can't escape it. But it's not just the rate of disruption that's different right now. We're also seeing that many emerging risks are just fundamentally different from a characteristical perspective as well. When compared to what we've historically focused on, today's risk is generally faster, leaving us with little to no time to react. It's more unstable, escalating and waning for unpredictable reasons. It's more elusive, meaning it's harder to identify and track. And it's generally more indiscriminate in that it takes advantage of the highly integrated and global supply chains that we all have to span geographic, category, and supplier boundaries. I mean, think about something like COVID or a natural disaster or war. Characteristically, these risk events are just fundamentally different than, say, regulatory noncompliance or poor supplier financial health. 2 things that we cared a lot about coming out of the last major crisis in 08 or 09. And it's these differences that are challenging procurement teams today. Because the reality is that our system of internal controls to manage risk is just not set up to handle these differences. What you're looking at here is a summary slide of some research we did on the topic. What we found is that the vast majority of procurement's risk-focused time is spent on preventative risk controls during due diligence and recertification phases of a supplier's lifecycle. And that's the issue. Because what we also found in this research is that 97% of procurement leaders reported identifying risk in between those 2 steps. And another 3/4 of them told us that the risk they did find could not have even been identified even with the best due diligence or the best recertification. In plain English, what this is showing is that today we have a system of internal controls to manage risk that is focused on prevention when most emerging risk is inherently just less preventable. So what's the solve? Well, I want to share two ideas with you today. First, leaders tell us it's about focusing more on that middle, that orange, what we call ongoing monitoring, really through better supplier management. But this doesn't mean that we have to do it all ourselves here. Instead, we should be focused on making supplier risk management, more business friendly to really enable stakeholders to become our eyes and ears so that we can really scale our ability to identify and manage risk across a larger number of suppliers. That's exactly what Fourth Wire did here in the summary case study that you see on the page. With this approach, procurement acts as the quarterback for a broader risk management team. They are a central feedback loop to the business who interact with suppliers, focus on creating an enterprise-wide view of supplier or category risk. They coach business partners on what to look for, and they bring together relevant subject matter experts to determine mitigation strategies in real time as new risks emerge. We call this approach business-led detection. And our analysis finds that it is more than twice effective at managing risk than due diligence alone. And there's three reasons. Number one, we're able to generate better real-time insights. Business partners are just in a better position to alert the organization to risk changes given the velocity and the variability of emerging risks. We also have a clearer line of sight in this approach. Because business partners are working directly with suppliers, changes in the landscape, scope, or other factors are more immediately apparent. And then we also have better monitoring across a larger portfolio. Emerging risks can occur anywhere in the supply base. So having broad monitoring by leveraging the business to become our eyes and ears provides us the broadest possible insight. Now, I told you I wanted to share with you two thoughts. The second idea I want to share with you on the topic of risk looks at how to avoid being disrupted in the first place. And that is to start managing your supply chain surface area. This idea requires a dedicated webinar in and of itself. But to quickly summarize the concept here, I want you to think about it this way. I want you to imagine your company's supply chain as a big old spider web. Now consider all the stuff that the spider web catches as risk events and disruptions. The idea here is that just like how the size, the density of nodes, and the tensile strength of a spider web dictates how much stuff it catches, our supply chain surface area determines how many risk events we experience. What we found is that in companies that actively manage their surface area in terms of number of suppliers, number of suppliers, number of suppliers, the location of those firms, the strength of logistics lines, and the number of process touch points, just to name a few, those companies are actually better able to manage risk. They make themselves a smaller target to hit and therefore experience only about 1/3 of the disruptions their industry peers experience.
Excel, email, and basic e-sourcing tools are not enough to make optimal sourcing decisions. Modern procurement teams need better tools that let them achieve sourcing excellence. Keelvar customers typically see 100% ROI after their first event, sourcing optimization, offload up to 90% of repetitive manual tasks with AI-powered autonomous sourcing, and unlock up to 5% savings. Keelvar powers some of the most demanding global sourcing teams, including Siemens, Microsoft, Samsung, Coca-Cola, and Novartis. Request a demo today at www.keelvar.com. Supply Frame is changing the way procurement teams find, source, and design electronics so manufacturers can reduce supply chain risk, accelerate product introductions, and take advantage of market opportunities. Powered by the world's largest network of active electronics professionals, Supply Frame's designed to source intelligence solutions give sourcing teams commodity-level insights into pricing, lead times, and inventory, as well as unique component design and demand forecasts. Find out how you can accelerate your digital transformation today at supplyframe.com.
We're nearing the home stretch now. In our final section, I want to talk about the growing risk of cognitive overload that we see in today's sourcing and procurement teams. The trend driving this is something called the Great Acceleration. And what it refers to is the rate of change in the world around us. Risk, disruption, technology, society, and the climate are all changing exponentially now. And here's the problem that poses for us in procurement. We simply don't progress or transform exponentially at the individual level. That is just not how we're wired, and that's not how we operate. We are much more linear in how we transform. And so every year we're living in this space where we see the world around us moving faster and faster and faster. And we're all left struggling to try and keep up, to try and keep pace. And it's not for a lack of trying either. I mean, we see procurement leaders every single day investing more and more in new technologies, new staff competencies, new governance models, new supplier relationships, new functional goals. They're doing this at breakneck speeds. And all of these investments are being made to try and quote unquote jump the curve so that we're able to keep pace with all of this accelerating change. But here's the issue. There's a downside to rapid transformation when you look at the individual team member, when you look at the individual staff member. With each new investment, staff have to incorporate new responsibilities, new tasks, new workarounds, new metrics, new workflows, new value streams, and new stakeholders. Each transformation introduces a tremendous amount of complexity into their work. We've done some surveys across the last number of months, and what we're hearing from staff members is that they believe the level of complexity in their day-to-day life has increased tremendously across the last 2 years. And when we ask them what they expect out into the future, they see no reprieve. Now, the prevailing assumption to this point has been that people, us, our staff, our teams, that we can transform in perpetuity. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case any longer. People are burnt out. We're seeing the manifestations of that. We're reaching the upper limits of how fast we can change with the things that we have listed on the outer ring here. We're seeing things like the Great Resignation, all these buzzwords, quiet quitting, burnout, mistrust, pervasive fatigue. All of these things are symptoms of a rapid problem we're experiencing. Put simply, staff are what we call cognitively overloaded, right? They tell us complexity has increased and they see no reprieve. And now they are in a position where they're being asked to do more, but maybe they don't fully understand how to do the quote unquote the more, or they have competing priorities that strain their time, or there's misalignment between what is being asked and their current goals. And as if burnout wasn't bad enough, the level of cognitive overload our staff are under seemed to be becoming a barrier to our own success. You see, we're making all these investments to try and transform to keep pace with accelerating change, but the pace at which we're doing it is actually working against us. Quite ironically, the investments to push us forward are becoming the very thing that's holding us back. So what are we to do, right? How do we offload this cognitive overload? We can't give up. We can't keep, we can't stop trying to transform. That's an untenable strategy. So what do we do? Well, there's a number of different solutions that we see emerging, ranging from technology to simplicity. But the one that I want to highlight for you today, and perhaps the one that's most proven, has to do with org design. It looks at this issue from an organizational design perspective. And it has to do with narrowing the focus of procurement roles as we expand the focus of our procurement priorities. Let me explain what I mean here. Imagine for a moment that you are the CEO of a startup. You just started a new business. Day one, when you do that, you're going to be simultaneously the CEO, the CFO, the CSCO, and the CHRO all at the same time. Eventually, though, you reach a point of mental saturation that dictates you can't do it all. So you hire a C-suite to bifurcate the work. A similar thing happens in a lot of different professions. Perhaps you're studying law. At first, you learn what everyone does, the basics. Eventually, though, you have to specialize because it becomes too complex. Same thing in medicine or business or any number of trades. What we're seeing is a similar thing happen in procurement today. For example, the idea that a role like category manager can simultaneously design category strategies, execute sourcing, manage suppliers, manage contracts, put out P2P and source to pay fires, and then somehow pivot to focus on sustainability, diversity, customer experience, innovation, supplier resilience, and supplier risk, all within the same day or week, is frankly being exposed. The mental switching costs associated with trying to do that are simply too great. So to illustrate what we see companies doing, take a look at this case study from UCB here. What they did is redesign their roles around specialized core work so that staff are more focused on specific activities and tasks. Now, as you can imagine, this requires some leadership buy-in to make happen, right? But to be sure, this will have to happen at a certain point. Complexity dictates it. Now, you may not be able to specialize immediately to the same extent that, say, UCB did here. But I would say that at a minimum, we need to try and bifurcate strategic work from the tactical work, thinking at a 30,000-foot view versus a 5-foot view within the same day comes with a lot of mental switching costs. And it's driving a lot of the cognitive overload that our teams are experiencing today. So to quickly summarize what I've covered today, let me leave you with this one pager before we open this up and dive into a bit of a Q&A. I want you to think about how you're going to balance stakeholder pressure. Consider what it will need from you in terms of how you prioritize your value streams of what you do. Elevate category management and standardize supplier management. When it comes to risk, focus on how it's different today. Rebalance your internal control frameworks to prioritize more ongoing monitoring. Bring the business into the conversation and limit the impact of disruption by managing your supply chain surface area. And then finally, don't ignore the human component to all of this. Staff are cognitively overloaded today. The expectations have grown tremendously, and we're at a point where more focused roles are entirely necessary to be successful. So with that, let me thank everyone for this portion of the time. Let's open it up, Bob, for a bit of a Q&A here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ryan. That is some great insights into category management procurement for now and for the coming years. So now we are at the audience question and answers portion of our presentation. And even as we are answering the questions that have already come in, audience members are invited to continue to submit your questions by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And we will get to as many of those questions as we can in the time allotted. So let me start with this one. It's a deceptively simple question, I guess. In a one-person procurement department, and there are indeed many of those, right? What would you say is the most essential role to hire next?
Well, I think despite what I said during the webinar, I think there's almost a Maslow's hierarchy of needs to sourcing's maturation process. There's certainly a crawl, walk, run type of transformation that happens within any organization. And the starting point, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the starting point is always sourcing, right? We have to master the sourcing process before we move on to any of the other things that we were talking about. Once we've done that, though, once we've mastered, the cost, quality, and speed, and we start being pulled into conversations that go beyond that, that's when we get into the category and supplier management. And a lot of companies are at that point. But in a one-person shop, I would say start small, master the basics before you start thinking about moving on.
Great, thank you. Of all the complications and complexities that you talked about, this questioner wants to know, what do you see as the biggest barrier to category management success?
Yeah, so I would say first and foremost, the lack of time, right? And this ties back into the last point I made around cognitive overload. I talk about category management every single week, almost every single day with clients. And it is the number one reason is they don't have the time. right? To look at market dynamics, spend analytics, enterprise priorities. Second to that is probably standardization, not knowing how to do it, but time for sure.
Thank you. How can I help my teams think more strategically about their roles in procurement? I mean, Ryan, sometimes the word strategy can be very vague, and these guys are doing their day-to-day responsibilities. How would you respond to that question?
Yeah. So there's two things that I would recommend. Number one, we did some research across the last year on this very question, and one of the things that we know about the question is that we can't L&D our way out of it. That means learning and development. We can't just simply, train our way out of this, train our staff to be quote unquote more strategic. What we can do though is control the functional climate that they operate within. So how do we put our staff in a position where strategic outcomes are a natural byproduct of just working in the organization, as opposed to the reality of today where driving towards a strategic outcome feels more like sweeping water uphill with a toothbrush. So part of this looks at how do we put in place the right metrics, the right role designs, the right incentive structures to make strategery, for lack of a better word, and a natural byproduct of just being in the organization. The other bit here that we're starting to see is modeling strategic thinking, right? How do we put in place the right frameworks for our teams to use to really show them what good looks like when we talk about strategic thinking. So
Great. What is the role of procurement technology in reducing what you refer to as cognitive overload?
yeah, so technology certainly has a place. I would say that it is a double-edged sword though. So I do this or I have this conversation sometimes live with audience members, and for fun every now and then I'll ask them, hey, how many passwords do you have to remember today, just in your life, right? And you have dozens, you have hundreds, some people thousands, I guess, depending on how tech savvy you are. But that paints the picture. Certainly, technology has a role that can help us, but it can equally hurt us if the UI is not well designed, if the experience of using the technology is not simplified, if it's not simple, easy to use, we can actually inadvertently drive up cognitive overload. And so I would say that we are well intended when we invest in technology to automate, to make things easier, et cetera. But there's a downside to it. We really have to pay attention to the end user experience of that technology, or we run the risk of actually, again, doing a little bit more harm.
Thanks. Are there times when reducing the surface area of your supply chain leads to fewer suppliers and thereby creating even more risk?
There are, right? There's a tension there, right, around putting all your eggs in one basket, right? We certainly, don't want to do that. It's more about raising supply chain surface area as a metric, as something we actively look at, so that we can make informed decisions around where do we want our risk tolerance to be, right? Are we willing to accept that sort of risk by reducing suppliers to, limit our exposure in some region or geography? And we're more comfortable with maybe the all eggs in our one basket, type risk, right? But it's about making that trade-off and understanding that trade-off can even be made in the first place.
Mm-hmm. This question kind of approaches it from the opposite direction and says, what is the impact of supplier diversification, which we are seeing quite a bit of these days, on the job of procurement and category management in terms of additional complexity, additional people needed, just doesn't that make life a lot more complex?
Absolutely, right. And I think in some ways we spoke about this at a couple different conferences this year. I mean, in some ways we're seeing a bit of I don't want to go so far as to say a rejection, but a challenge to classic JIT, just in time kind of methodologies and frameworks that organize a supply chain purely around efficiency, supplier redundancy, supplier diversification, ensuring we have backup suppliers is a strategy, a tactic that a lot of our companies that we work with are pursuing. But I mean, you're absolutely right. It certainly adds complexity in terms of where are we going to do that, right? That's a decision the category manager and the sourcing manager needs to make. And then on the back end, managing those relationships becomes more complex too, because there's more of them. There's more to do, right? There's more scorecards, there's more QBRs, there's more governance plans that need to be executed against when we have more suppliers. And so certainly there's a tension there. But again, it goes back to risk tolerance and what are we willing to accept.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking a lot about internal procurement, and this questioner wants to take us out and says, how can a small company achieve or receive the same priority as a large company from a supplier? I mean, regardless of all the innovations you're making in-house, are you seeing smaller companies working together as a co-op, for example?
We certainly do. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's co-ops, there's consortiums that exist, leveraging our buying power for certain commodities or certain categories of spend. Companies certainly do that. The other way that you can think about, putting yourself in a position to maybe receive some favorable treatment from a supplier would be to focus on what we call customer of choice type behavior, right? So just like in procurement, we segment our suppliers and we put a label on our supply base to say, okay, we have this bucket of strategic, or we have this bucket of niche, or we have this bucket of transactional. CRM technology, customer relationship management technology, has enabled our suppliers to do the same thing to us as customers, right? And knowing that, we can actually start to think about how do we control that, and how do we take a look at ourselves in the mirror and ask the question of, are we someone that we would want to work with, right? So when maybe we don't have the same buying power as the Fortune 100 companies would, we can still ask the question of, are we someone that's easy to do business with? Are we living up to our commitments? Are we respecting our suppliers' margins? And how can we generate some of that favorable treatment as a result? So, there's a couple things that I would say, certainly co-ops, consortium, things of that nature, but there's also the relationship management aspect of this. I mean, business at the end of the day is the application of sociology to generate value, right? It's two human beings coming together, and so we can acknowledge that and play to that, right, and become what we call a customer of choice.
That becomes so important these days. I'm really glad that you hit on that, Ryan. This questioner would like you, I guess, to elaborate a little bit on what you had already said about technology, because he says it seems like we already have more modules that we can handle to help us do things efficiently. He says, if you had a technology wish list, what would be in the first two places?
I would say, and this is based on the conversations I have with clients right now, the differentiator between organizations in the tech space to me is not so much about having all of the latest and greatest technologies. It's really more about your ability to use them and wield them. The state of procurement technology, in my opinion, feels a lot like the person that buys the latest and greatest golf clubs every single year but never works on their swing. They have the best tech, but their handicap never goes down. They never get better. And so my wish list would be to start paying a hell of a lot more attention to tech change management and UI. The way I always frame it, where's my phone? I think about it this way. What made this so successful, right? That the iPhone. It was because it was simple. It was easy to use. I click a button back in 2007 when it came out, and I know how to use it, right? The design of the entire experience of using the iPhone was about simplicity, right? I could turn it on and I figured out how to use it. Do we have the same level of simplicity in our technology ecosystems today? Absolutely not, right? We see companies downloading the latest and greatest data from their ERP system into what? Microsoft Excel. How does that make any sense, right? And so one of the things that I would challenge a lot of the folks on the line today would be to look at the end user experience of technology. One of the most innovative metrics that I've seen a procurement leader starting to track recently was around the number of clicks it takes to accomplish something. That's actually on their dashboard now. So they've invested all of this money in technology, and they're looking at, okay, if it takes 78 clicks to go from point A to point B, is that something that we're actually going to use often? Are we actually driving a lot of the overload, the consternation, the bureaucracy, if you will, within the organization? So a bit of a long-winded response, but hopefully that.
No, it's a great response. When it comes to role redesign to reduce cognitive overload, what does that mean often in terms of the need for additional staff, and who is the person who's going to be overseeing all those divided tasks ultimately? Somebody kind of looking over everybody's doing everything.
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, there's many. Well, I'm going to go in reverse order to that question. I'm going to answer the last part before I jump to the former. So there's a lot of different organizational models that you can use in terms of the box and whisker chart. Who's over what and who's going to kind of managing what. What I would say though, as a general principle or some guiding wisdom in response to that, is the successful org design is one that is well connected. What we see is that certain roles mainly I would say the category manager role is becoming this, almost becomes the glue between all the other functional activities that are being executed within procurement. It's how we ensure the left hand is talking to the right hand when we execute the acquisition lifecycle. So the most common situation or the most common structure that I would give you is one that is organized by first category, then activity, right? So you have category A, sourcing, supplier management, contract management, risk management, depending on how narrow you want to design your roles. You could equally flip that in a COE-like model, or you could equally flip that in a more decentralized business unit or regional focus model. But the insight here is it's really at the end of the day about connection, right? How well are we connecting these disparate roles together? The former part of the question, I believe, was around
Well, how many people do you have to add to your staff in order to reduce cognitive overload?
Absolutely. I mean, and that is an important question. What I would say there's no single answer to the FTE question, right? It's a function of how do we make things simpler and how do we automate the more transactional activities, right? So that we can free up time, energy, and resources to focus on the strategic. But then at the same time, there's a business case that needs to be made by procurement leaders to their leadership to say, look, if the expectations for procurement have moved away from just cost, quality, and speed to now thinking about sustainability, innovation, risk, customer experience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, at a certain point, there does need to be an investment in the team. I mean, we've seen this in terms of the history of procurement writ large. You know, we went from purchasing to buying to sourcing to strategic sourcing to now category and supplier management. And every step of the way, the team's gotten bigger. So it's not uncommon, but I think it's incumbent upon the procurement leader to really position it that way, right? There's been an explosion of asks and responsibilities. We need to think about how can we do this and how can we get the right resources to actually support it.
Great. Are there any other emerging trends on the horizon that procurement leaders should be aware of?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple. One, I would say cybersecurity is probably going to end up being on the procurement leader's radar to a much greater extent than it is today, out into the future. You know, one of the things we know about cyber attacks, ransomware, kind of all of those sorts of things, is that the vast majority of them occur in the supply chain, right? And so knowing that a lot of the incidents actually happen in the supply chain, it's going to start, we're going to be starting to be looked at in terms of what do we do? How do we start to insulate our business? And so partnership with the CISO, partnership with the IT teams, partnership with our suppliers, with increasing our ability to kind of establish standards and controls for how we think about cybersecurity is going to grow in importance. The other thing that I think we're going to start seeing here is a bigger focus on energy, particularly around energy instability. So today, you know, at least in the Western world, we are typically relying on 100-plus-year-old infrastructure for how we source energy, and it's typically from utilities, right? We have a very centralized energy management module today. Us, our suppliers, governments, everyone. What we're starting to see, though, is that singular focus, that centralized energy management infrastructure represents a single source of failure for a lot of supply chains, right? If that utility goes down, if a weather event hits it, if a geopolitical unrest challenges that, we're being whiplashed by prices going up and down, by the security of energy writ large. And so that's an issue, right? I mean, that's an underpinning thing that we need stability in order to make downstream decisions. So what companies are starting to think about and starting to do is they're asking the question of, well, how can we take control back of our energy future? How can we democratize energy management? How can we decentralize it and make it a little bit more distributed and frankly sustainable, right? Investing more and more in things like solar, wind, renewables to really take control back for their energy future.
Thank you. This questioner, I think, would like to talk a little bit more about the idea of supplier diversification from the standpoint of e-commerce. The question is, how do you see e-commerce playing a role for procurement leaders and category management, especially after COVID, when there was a high need to source from various channels than the traditional sole source slash dual source contracts. I assume we're talking about B2B e-commerce here. What is the role that plays in helping to approach some of these issues that we've been talking about today?
Yeah. So we've seen a bit of an uptick on. I'm going to frame this as kind of a buying channel slash contracting vehicle type question. So I apologize if that's maybe a different angle than you were expecting, but that's kind of what I'm hearing.
Sure.
We certainly have seen an increase in questions related to buying channels writ large, right? Historically, and what's interesting about this is historically, you know, we as buyers, we in procurement have had the leverage when it comes to the buyer and seller relationship. We've enjoyed having the power dynamic in our favor for 50 plus years. The last 2 years, it's gone the other way, right? We've seen supply chain shortages, inflation, all of these issues shift the balance of power back to sellers. And what they've done with that, and what we've seen companies do with that power, is they're now asserting it in terms of how we actually acquire goods and services. So if you're in procurement, you want to issue POs, you control the T's and C's, you want MSAs, you want rigid structure. If you're in sales, you want money now, right? You're fine with P cards. You're fine with e-commerce transactions. You're fine with speed. You're trying to generate cash flow. And so we've seen a lot of procurement organizations that have had to be a bit more flexible in the buying channels and the contracting vehicles that they're willing to think about and entertain just to ensure sources of supply. I don't know the staying power of that, only because, depending on where the economy goes, we might see that balance of power kind of shift back to the buyer landscape at a certain point. But it's certainly an interesting question. On the B2B kind of e-commerce front, I think, there's a couple suppliers in that space that dominate and kind of have the market cornered. We do certainly see that for a lot of tail spend type requirements. I think that's super common, but you run some risk there. A lot of counterfeit items, you have lack of control, sometimes even less spend visibility, depending on who you're going with. So there's pros and cons, but it depends on what you want, right? It depends on what the goal is for the category of spend.
Well, unfortunately, we are just about out of time. We have time for just one more question, Ryan, and here it is. What advice would you give procurement leaders today who believe we're either in a recession or they're preparing for the scenario of one becoming reality?
Yeah. So it's a question that I think is being raised a lot more today. And there's really, I think there's 3 things that we need to think about. Number one, economic headwinds and a potential recession, they're not going to hit us in the same way across the entire organization. Different business units, different categories of spend, different areas are going to be hit differently. And I think this is an argument for category management as an approach, because that gives us the ability to think about decisions at a lower level, right? We can respond at the category level as opposed to one size fits all. The second thing that I would say is, if you just look at the history of the ideal response in a recessionary environment from procurement's perspective, it's always been about supplier relationships. We're as strong as our weakest link. We really need to shore up those relationships if we believe we are either in a recession or we're pending a recession, in the immediate near term. If we believe that, we should probably be shoring up those relationships right now, right? The last thing that I would say has to do with this idea of cognitive overload again. If that were to manifest, if we see a severe global downturn, as an example, to the staff, at the staff level, that is going to feel like just another thing in the long list of things that they've had to respond to and deal with across the last couple of years. And so we can't ignore the human component here, right? Our people are not cogs in a machine. And so we need to pay attention to how overloaded are they and what can we do as the leader to try and offload that, provide an escape valve, a relief valve to offload some of that cognitive consternation that occurs.
Great, thank you. By the way, I was going to ask the question if you would please introduce me to that 15% of supply chain professionals who are not suffering from cognitive overload. But we'll leave that for another day. We are unfortunately out of time. Ryan, thank you so much for a great presentation. I really appreciate it. Audience, thank you as well for listening in and for your fantastic questions. Do want to remind everybody, though, about these 4 opportunities to meet up with Gartner analysts and subject matter experts in 2023. First of all, the Gartner Supply Chain Symposium Expo. 2 dates there, May 8th through 10th in Orlando, Florida, and June 5th through 7th in Barcelona, Spain. And the Gartner Supply Chain Planning Summit, October 30th through 31st in London, November 29th through 30th in Phoenix, Arizona. Learn more at gartner.com/conf/SC. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you very much, Ryan. Everybody, have a fantastic day.